Good day, students. Welcome to our next lesson. This week's lesson will actually be our final lecture form. It is not our last lesson for the course, but this is the final one that comes in lecture form. All right, so this week we will be looking at environmental negotiation. So for this week's lesson, we will be covering the following briefly. We'll be first looking at the nature and importance of environmental negotiation. And as a matter of fact, a lot of what we have already discussed for the semester actually feeds into this topic. So we have actually been progressively building to a conclusion here with regards to environmental negotiation. And then we will spend most of the rest of the lesson actually looking at the negotiation process. All right, so we will be looking at the process. The different stages of the process that we'll be looking at may not necessarily match these terms exactly, but they are more or less the same thing. All right. So let's look first at environmental negotiations and the concept. What is the concept? What is it all about? Again, this should not be new to you because we have been building towards this all semester thus far. So we know that when there are competing interests that can affect the environment, this is a reason for needing to have environmental negotiations. All right. And when we talk about affecting the environment, remember as environmentalists, you know that the environment is not only our natural environment, it is all three of those pillars or spheres of the environment. So that's your ecological, the human, and the built environment. So the parties that may be included in this negotiation may include corporate entities. This may also include government. When we talk about corporate entities with large organizations, it may include individual and communities. So depending on the complexity of the issue, it may include all of these. If it's not quite as complex, it may not be all. So negotiation is a cooperative approach that can benefit all the parties involved. So that really is the purpose of it. We know that if there's an environmental problem, all of the parties involved need to come together to try to solve that issue. I think that's a definition we would have looked at before. So for negotiation to work, there must be some level of trust on all sides. Trust is important in resolving disputes. Remember again, we had looked at some of these issues before. When it comes to negotiation, that level of trust is so critical, because if there's even one party involved where it is deemed that this person may have a selfish, or organization or person may have a selfish agenda, or there may be a conflict of interest, there will be a lack of willingness to actually make an agreement with that party. So where there's an absence of trust, it makes negotiation it makes it difficult or almost impossible. So trust is critical. Remember, we had in previous lessons talked about trust with regards to how integrity and issues like that can feed in to an atmosphere of trust or distrust, as the case might be. So negotiations should also be based on facts. All right. And those facts may require a joint fact-finding exercise that involves all stakeholders, which would include experts as well. So that can actually, this issue of fact-finding and the negotiation being based on facts can also feed into that element of trust as well. Because where there is an absence of facts, all you are left with a person's views and opinions. And views and opinions can often be based on a person's particular world view, how they see the world, what are their particular objectives, what is their agenda. So if you can provide facts, facts more or less helps to level the playing field, if you will. So if you are also able to bring in technical experts from the outside, these persons can also provide what may seem to be an unbiased point of view as well. So additionally, with regards to negotiations of any type, including environmental negotiation, you would want to have a facilitator or a mediator. And having this person on your team, this is important because, again, here's the issue of bias. It removes the appearance of bias from the negotiation process. All right. So we know negotiations can be a very tricky thing, which is why you want to remove that appearance of bias so that you can somehow provide some level of trust and some level of comfort for the stakeholders. And again, fact finding or provision of facts are also very important. So let's look now briefly at the negotiation process. So when we are talking about environmental negotiations, multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs, as you all already should be familiar with to some extent, MEAs are the result of the negotiation, the environmental negotiation. All right, so that's a very important point to remember. So the MEA is the result of the completion of the environmental negotiation. MEAs differ in scope and substance according to the specific situations. So of course, there is no one size fits all. You may have frameworks by which they can be developed, but the scope and the substance, again, will be tailored to the specific situation. Simple issues, environmental issues may have a simple MEA. And of course, the more complex the issue is, you find it would be much broader in scope. So when we talk about MEAs now, let us look at the development process. So there are several stages in the development process of the MEA. And we're going to look at each one in turn briefly. We have the pre-negotiation stage. In other words, what preparations need to be made before negotiations can take place. There's a negotiation stage, followed by the adoption and signature, the ratification and I beg your pardon, I keep mispronouncing this, accession, ratification and accession, and then of course, finally entry into force. So that is essentially the implementation of the MEAs that parties would have committed to. So let's look at the pre-negotiations or the preparation stage. So the first step is to I beg your pardon, I have a typo there as well. So the first step is to decide whether there is a need for action and whether joint action is feasible. So what you're doing here is really a situation analysis. You're assessing the situation to make a determination. What is the problem? What is the scope of the problem? Does it need to be addressed immediately? Who would be affected? All of these things will have to be assessed. All right, so you need to make a decision here with regards to that situation analysis. So additionally, this process can be informal, or you may have formal consultations at this stage, and it can take place at several levels, again, depending on the nature of the problem and the scope of the problem. It may be national, regional, or international. All right, so the levels at which it takes place depends on the complexity and the scope of the problem. Often national governments or intergovernment organizations, they would often be the ones or the parties to take the lead at this stage of the process, the negotiation process. Oftentimes because they're the ones who have the resources, they have the technical expertise, access to broad cross-section of information and costs, etc. So they are actually able to pull the information together to really get an understanding of the big picture. Hence the reason you find that these are the agencies or organizations that would initiate the negotiation process. Also, additionally, scientific data. Here, the issue of scientific data is raised again. This is critical at this stage to assess the need for and the feasibility of negotiating to address any environmental problem, because of course you all are being trained as scientists, and you know that in order to be able to successfully solve any problem, you need to first understand the problem. And being able to understand the problem requires information and data. In this case, we're talking about scientific data. Let me give you an example. Remember, in one of your previous courses, if you have completed ENVS 460 already, you would have learned about the DPSIR environmental monitoring and assessment framework. And in this framework, you know, there are stages where you have to consider the environmental state of an environment, where you're looking at the drivers, you're looking at the pressures, and then you're looking at the state of the environment and what those impacts can be. All right, so you have different frameworks and different tools that can be used in order to collect, organize, and interpret this data. So scientific data of this nature can be very useful and very important in terms of successful negotiation. All right, so that was a little throwback to some of the information that you would have covered in previous courses. And for those of you who may not have done ENVS 460 already, you just got a brief introduction to environmental monitoring. Also at this stage, you want to look at your existing legal framework and regulations. This should also be evaluated at this time in order to determine if you have if they are binding agreements that address similar issues. Because if you have an existing legal framework, regulations, and policies in place already, and especially if they are legally binding, you know you need to function within that framework, within those boundaries. If on the other hand, your assessment or evaluation of your legal framework identifies weaknesses in the legal framework, this may be the time that you want to consider updating your laws, environmental laws, regulations, etc. All right. So again, as I said, a big part of this preparation for negotiation stage involves situation analysis as an assessment of the particular situation at that point in time. So then that would prepare us for the negotiation stage. So at this stage, this is where you start preparing your structure for negotiation. So we're talking about essentially like your management structure. Committees would be established to address issues of procedures and costs. So these committees, they are the ones who will develop procedures and guidelines for how the negotiations are to proceed. They will establish budgets, etc. And the committees will also provide oversight for the process. So they would be like the managers for the negotiation process, as I said. So initial meetings, the first order of business would be to create those procedural rules that we just mentioned. Right? So this is the first thing they have to do, create those rules to help guide the process itself. And who are the participants of these committees? They should include all major stakeholders. So you would want to have representatives from all major stakeholders. So we are not just talking about government officials and technical experts, but we are talking also about those stakeholders who can be and are affected by the environmental issue itself. So members of the community, villages, towns, etc. what's the term again? Your disadvantaged groups or disenfranchised groups, etc. You'd want to have representation. Okay, but additionally, in terms of your management structure, if you are dealing with a very complex issue, you would also want to make provision for subcommittees within that larger framework, management framework, because those each subcommittee can then focus on a specific aspect of the problem. All right. Last point, opportunities should be provided for both formal and informal negotiations to take place where all parties are present. So we're talking about communication opportunities for the purpose of negotiation. So examples of formal, maybe ad hoc conferences. So that would, an ad hoc conference would be like a one-off conference, not that would be different from where you would often see annual conferences. So this would be for a particular purpose. Then some informal communication or negotiation opportunities, maybe in smaller groups behind closed doors. All right, those informal meetings may not take a lot of planning, and it can happen quickly as well. So then we move to the next stage of adoption and signature. Right, so we have already established the procedures for the negotiation process, right? So now we are looking at adoption and signature. So the responsibility for managing this stage is placed in the hands of someone entrusted with full authority to act on behalf of his or her government or organization, such as an ambassador. All right, so what we are assuming here at this stage now is that the negotiations and let us say an MEA has already been established, right? So now we are looking at moving to the next stage, adoption and signature. So this person with full authority is, remember, just a representative of the government or organization. That means then that the government or the organization, they would have made a decision, but this person will act on their behalf to sign. So an enabling decision is adopted by the body. So a body might be the United Nations or an agency like the EMA. So this body now, they will detail the purpose of the signing, the dates, and the venue. All right. So the purpose of that particular function that they are organizing, they have taken responsibility for it, the purpose of it, the dates, and the venue. All right, for adoption and signature. This stage is similarly guided by established procedural rules. So there actually would have been rules that would have been established, in this case, by the body that is taking the responsibility as to how this process will go through. However, please note, parties may agree upon new procedural rules at this stage as well. All right, so there's some flexibility there. As it is determined that certain rules need to be added or modified or whatever the case may be. All right, so there is room for that. This stage can also happen very quickly after the completion of the negotiation. So again, you're reminded here, between this stage and the stage before that we have just discussed, the negotiation itself, the actual negotiation process that would produce an MEA has been completed. So an MEA already exists, therefore just awaiting sign off and adoption. However, please note, before adoption and signatures are added, documents need to be prepared and time for negotiators to report the results of the negotiations to their respective governments and agencies. So of course, as mentioned before, remember the representative who has been given authority to sign on behalf of the government or the agency, they have to take the information back to their governments or agencies, and time must be given for them to review the information and come to a position before the sign off, before the adoption and sign off can take place. All right, so you just want to bear that in mind. The next stage now is ratification and accession. So parties are given time to consider their position on the agreement presented before them, right? So we just said that. Now the process of ratification ensures that the country representatives have not overstepped their authority in negotiating the agreement, right? So therefore, before signing, careful review and consideration of the agreement is necessary. So the negotiation has been completed. The agreement has been taken back to the government or the agency for them for careful review. At that point, they need to make sure that their representative in participating in the negotiation process, that they have not overstepped their authority. Once that has been determined to be, everything has been determined to be in order, then ratification can take place. So in ratifying an agreement, a country formally declares its consent to be bound by the agreement's terms. Accession is similar to ratification. So ratification, you're declaring your consent, your agreement. Accession, as we say here, is similar. So if a country seeks to make a formal commitment to the agreement after the expiration of the time frame allotted by the MEA itself for the process, for the ratification process, this is termed accession. So in other words, accession, this is when you're coming in to declare your agreement or commitment after the deadline for ratification has expired. So you're now, in other words, there is flexibility here to come into agreement with it. So you have now accessed. And then the last point, the depository examines whether the documents presented are in proper form, in proper order, and whether the conditions required for entry into force have been met. So this is actually a person, right? So this person examines the documents to make sure that they're in proper order before the agreement is actually put into force, or in other words, implemented. So that means now we have moved now to this stage of entry into force. So during the pre-negotiation or the negotiation phases, those were the first two phases we discussed, the parties, they all agreed to specific rules regarding entry into force. So all of that was defined upfront. All that was part of the preparation process, right? So most MEAs employ a system in which entry into force depends on a particular number of ratifications, acceptances, approval, and accessions received. So you're looking to see numbers, how many, right? Those numbers will help you determine if you reach a critical mass. That, in other words, that critical number, that minimum number that you need to have to ensure that you can meet the goals of the MEA that has been developed, right? So for entry into force, we're saying that that number ensures the achievement of a critical mass of participating states and or agencies so that the parties that commit to the agreement are capable of realizing its goals and objectives. So we have a point here. So normally MEAs require anywhere from 20% to 30% of the participation of potential parties. So if you consider it, if you have this agreement, and you, especially if you have a complex issue, there will be a particular point at which you know that you will need a certain number or a minimum number of agreements and commitments to actually take action and implement the agreement and the things that parties have committed to in order to actually see change. Because if you have, let us say, 1 out of 100 actually committing, let me not say just committing, but actually implementing the agreement, you will find that it's not going to have much of an impact, if any at all. It would be negligible. But according to the experts, they have determined that MEAs will require anywhere from 20 to 30% commitment to enter into force or to implement the agreements within the MEA. So in summary then, we are seeing that environmental negotiations are often a critical requirement where disputes and disagreement arise regarding issues that affect all aspects of the environment. So we know that. So that's actually, one of the first definitions we looked at. Successful negotiations require a high level of trust. However, trust alone cannot work. Facts, as provided by scientific data, procedural rules guide the negotiation process for all parties, and the function of a mediator are all critical to the success of resolving the issue. Right? So we're saying we need trust, we need scientific facts, we need order in the negotiation process, and we need a mediator to bring about some level of trust, so that as we said, that appearance of bias does not exist in order to facilitate successful negotiation. So the final adoption of the agreement is also dependent on the quality of the agreement. So we have to determine quality. We ask ourselves some questions. Does the agreement satisfy the needs of all parties? Does the agreement clearly define reasonable boundaries for authority for parties involved? All right. In other words, you don't want to know that certain parties involved in the negotiation process seem to have unfair authority where they can make decisions that can affect parties in a negative way. For example, government may have quite wide-ranging authority in in a national context, right? If they choose to make decisions now, those decisions can affect local communities. All right, so these are issues you want to look at. Are they does it clearly define reasonable boundaries? So we want to know that those boundaries are reasonable. And then lastly, we ask the question, does this agreement permit individual states and or agencies to operate within their current legal framework? We talked about that. Or is it necessary for changes to be made in order to implement the agreement? All right, so entry into force can also be dependent on those issues. Does your current legal framework facilitate your implementation of the MEA agreements, or do you need to make legislative changes to facilitate it? So that concludes our lesson for this week. At this stage, as usual, I would like to direct you to the Unit 7 resources available for you in the lesson block. As would have been the pattern in previous lessons, many of the resources there are actually sources of information provided in this lecture and can therefore provide additional details for you. So please refer to the link for those resources for additional reading. You, with regards to the activities, you are asked to review the Harvard Principles of Negotiations video. I believe that is in the link. So review that first, along with your lecture material and additional reading, and then you are asked to complete the lesson review quiz. So thank you for joining me for this week's lesson. I will see you all online.